that there is some sort of a cover-up or some hiding in documents that, in redacted documents that have been submitted. And then on our
I'll be splitting my time with the member for Huron-Bruce. Oscar Wilde said that a cynic is someone who knows the price of everything but the value of nothing. And that perfectly encapsulates this government. They know the price, the very high price, that they've made Canadians pay, but they confuse that high price for value. You see, instead of judging our performance in government during COVID based on the mortality rates, the unemployment rates, the vaccination rates of our country, all of which are among the worst, they think that they should be rewarded just because their programs are the most expensive. I mean, today, they were literally bragging that their programs are big and fat. Not smart and effective, but big and fat as, not as a means to an end, but as ends in and of themselves. Now, one would think that you would judge the value of the government's actions by, for example, the percentage of people who've been vaccinated. But if they did that, of course, we would find that Canada is the worst in the G7. They might want to judge the performance of the government on the basis on jobs on the basis of the unemployment rate. But of course, if they judged the value of their actions on that basis, they would again find Canada worst in the G7. So instead, they tell us, don't worry about the value of our performance, congratulate us simply because we delivered this bad performance at the highest possible price. You know, they are literally like a used car salesman's dream. They show up and they say, give me the most expensive car on the lot. Make, model, condition, doesn't matter. Whichever one will add the biggest bill to my credit card, that must be the best one. You know, think of other countries if they thought like this. Taiwan, for example. Taiwan has a COVID mortality rate of 0.04 per 100,000. We have a mortality rate of 59 per 100,000. In other words, our mortality rate here in Canada is more than 1,400 times higher than in Taiwan. But that doesn't matter because Taiwan has a smaller deficit. Their deficit is 4% of GDP, whereas ours is about 17% of GDP. So liberals would say that their plan and their performance is 3 times greater because it's 3 times more expensive. Can you imagine the Taiwanese people holding a protest and saying, sure, you kept our mortality rate down, sure, fewer people died, but you weren't as expensive as the Canadian Liberals, so you obviously don't care as much as them. That would be how the Taiwanese people would look at their success in managing COVID if they were judging simply on the basis of how expensive their governments can be. But this is the approach that they've taken on everything. Let's take infrastructure. Parliamentary Budget Officer found when he looked that this $180 billion infrastructure program that they have and have been bragging about has no associated plan. Now, we know it's the best because it's the most expensive. The government brags all the time that it's twice as expensive as the previous government's infrastructure plan. Therefore, it must be twice as good. And so when I asked, how do you even spend $180 billion without a plan? The then infrastructure minister stood up and said, well, we got 20 buses in Halifax. To which I replied, how much does that work out to per bus? I mean, are they all made out of solid gold? So then we went over to the Finance Committee and I asked the Parliamentary Budget Officer if he'd seen a list of the projects that had been funded through this $180 billion plan. He said, yeah, they have a list, but it only accounts for half the money spent. And I said to him, if I come home from shopping for groceries and I've spent a lot of money, and I say, honey, I want you to congratulate me. I've spent more money on groceries than anyone in the history of the world. And she says, well, what did you get? Well, I say, I only have a receipt that accounts for half of what I spent. I can tell you, I'm going to be sleeping in the doghouse that night, okay? And the reality is, in most human existence, people don't judge their performance by how expensive they can be. They judge it by what they get for their money. They judge their success by the value they obtained, not just the price they paid. I mean, only in government would you advertise yourself as the most expensive product around and expect to get more business. Can you imagine a restaurant operating that way? Come dine with us. Terrible service. Food isn't very good, but we charge more than anyone else, therefore we must be the best. It's not just in infrastructure. In housing, for example, the Liberal member for Spadina stood up in this House and said, we have a $70 billion housing plan, as though we're supposed to congratulate them because it's really expensive, not based on what it does. What has it actually delivered? Well, Vancouver is the second most expensive place on planet Earth in which to buy a house now, if you compare average income to average house price. Toronto is number 6. We're one of the most sparsely populated nations on planet Earth. We should be the most affordable place to have to buy a home. But somehow, under this government, housing has become one of the most expensive things to buy anywhere in the world, right here in Canada. In fact, for a house to be affordable, it can't take up more than a third of a family's income. The average house takes up 50% of the average family's income in Canada. In other words, the average house is 2/3 more expensive than the average family can afford here in Canada, one of the most sparsely populated places on planet Earth, where we have more spaces where there's no one than we have places where there's anyone. And in that member's hometown, the one bragging about the $70 billion worth of spending they've done on housing, well, according to a leading poverty group there, 98% occupancy in homeless shelters, 330,000 people on waiting list for affordable housing, 10,000 homeless people in that member's hometown. Where did the $70 billion go? Maybe if he doubled that budget, there would be twice as many homeless people. But that's what happens when you judge your success not based on what you do, but on what it costs other people for you to do it. Now, if you think that it's impossible to get more for less, I ask you to look at other countries that do exactly that. Think of this. Singapore has life expectancy over a year longer than Canada. They rank better than us on the United Nations Human Development Index. And guess what? Their government costs 14 cents of GDP, 14 cents per every dollar of GDP. In Canada, it's 41 cents. Ireland, Switzerland, Hong Kong, Australia, the UK, New Zealand, all outrank Canada on the United Nations Human Development Index, even though the cost of their governments as a share of GDP is smaller than here in Canada. In other words, they delivered some combination of longer life expectancies, more schooling, and or higher GDP per capita for their population at a lower cost. That's because they judge success based on value, not on price. They don't go around bragging that they have the most expensive programs around. They work to make their programs successful and in delivering results for people. Here in Canada, we could do the same. If we'd stop bragging about the billions we can push out the door, my program has more billions than your program, for example, and start talking about the good that they can do. We should unleash the power of our free enterprise system to deliver more for less, make life more affordable for people, including for taxpayers. That would be a new and different approach by which we could judge success in this place, and perhaps when you judge things by the right metric, that is to say, value, rather than the wrong method, price, then you get better results and a higher standard of living for your people. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Kingston and the Adams.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. And wow, do I enjoy the interventions by this member. It is quite entertaining. I'm just glad he doesn't charge admission, because I'd probably just keep coming back and paying more and more to see this all day. His problem with talking about the mortality rate, Madam Speaker, and I noticed I did that, is he had to dig all the way down to Taiwan to find an example that would fit his narrative. But when he talks about the unemployment rate and everything else, he always compares us to the G7. So my question is, why won't he compare the mortality rate in his example to the countries in the G7? Well, that's obvious, because we have the second lowest mortality rate in the G7. So would he not at least recognize that through the great work of Canadians across this country, through the work that this Parliament has done together, working together to provide programs for Canadians, together, through unanimous consent quite often, that we have not together achieved so much for Canadians and indeed helped the quality of life during this pandemic?
For Carleton.
Well, I remarked that the member said he would keep paying more and more and more for my speech. That was exactly the point of my speech, that they will pay more and more and more for anything. But luckily, Madam Chair, I believe in free speech, and that's why my speech was free today. So now, Madam Speaker, on the question of the stats, and now he's got me distracted. On the question of the stats, he talks about mortality rates. Let me list a group of countries here. New Zealand, South Korea, Australia, Japan, Iceland, India, Norway, UAE, Denmark, Finland, all have lower unemployment and lower COVID mortality rates. They did a better job of protecting lives and livelihoods. That, and not how expensive we can make it to present and future generations, is how we should judge success.
Questions et commentaires. L'honorable député d'Avignon-Lamitis.
The honourable member. Thank you, Madam Speaker. I'd like to thank my colleague for his speech. We haven't had a federal budget since spring of 2019. Quebec, the provinces and the territories presented budgets in 2020. Quebec will table another one in March. All G7 countries have tabled a budget except for Canada. And the Liberals have been spending blindly, but that is not necessarily what helps people. And in areas like mine, there are people and companies which have fallen through the cracks of the safety system. And this is why I like the Conservative motion, because it's very targeted and the needs vary from one sector to another. So can you speak more to the sectoral approach? The honourable member. First, I'd like to thank the member for her excellent question. First, the government made balanced budgets a thing of the past. And now, well, they're deciding to abolish all budgets. Not only balanced budgets, but all. Why does the government not want to table a budget? Normally, governments love tabling budgets because it's an opportunity to show everything they want to do for Canadians, and polls usually show an increase in popularity for governments which table a budget. But this government does not want to know the extent to which this government has destroyed our public finances and the dire situation the country is in. This is why the Liberals do not want to table a budget.
For Nanaimo Ladysmith.
Well, thank you, Madam Speaker, and I'd like to thank the honourable member for his speech. And I was particularly interested in the section about affordable housing and how Vancouver has become one of the most expensive places to live in Canada. And I would note that it was during the Conservative government that the tax loopholes and the use of real estate as a tax haven and a place to launder money drove up real estate prices in Vancouver, and we're feeling it here in my riding of Nanaimo Ladysmith. We also have predatory investors that are investing into affordable housing, real estate investment trusts that pay a very low tax rate, and I would like to know from the honourable member whether he thinks we need more regulation in the housing market, whether we should have rent and vacancy control.
I have to give the honourable member an opportunity to answer 10 seconds.
Well, I would simply point out that far-left politicians at all three levels of government have been driving up housing costs in all of our big cities for a very long time to the advantage of the very rich at the expense of the very poor. And the last thing we need is for those very same far-left politicians to do any more of that.